Welcome to another 2024 Senate prediction. We're going to address every single latest poll in the battleground states right now. So first and foremost, I want to start off with a somewhat filled in map. The states that are filled in aren't going to be discussed. We already have 48 solidified Republican ones, and I'd venture to say you have 50. But the point is that there is some interesting polling going on. So for example, Washington is an interesting one because in the most recent poll, we see that Garcia, the Republican presumptive opponent against Cantwell, the incumbent, who's been there for about 20 years, by the way, she is apparently running for the fourth time. And she's only winning by 9. Okay, while that is a big win in Washington, it really isn't when you scale it to reality. You look at 2018, Maria Cantwell won by double that margin. She won by about 17%. Okay, you look at 2012, she won 2012 by over 20%. You look at 2006, she won the state of Washington by over 17%. And so to really have it within 10 shows that the race in and of itself is really more open than people think. It's still a blue state, according to the most recent polls, but I think it's probably a terrifying thing for Democrats, to be honest. The most recent polls have Peter Schiff, I believe, or Adam Schiff, winning by about 24%. As of a couple months ago, you can see they're not really putting money into polling the place, which makes sense. But you can see a Democrat in the Senate do way better than Biden does percentage-wise coming in this election. So let's move on to the next state. We're going to do Florida. As Florida is quickly becoming the new Republican Iowa or Ohio, we see that Tim Scott's leading by about 8 percentage points in less than 3 weeks ago, is the most recent poll we have here by CBS News. You can see now that Scott is up by 8. Also notice that the Florida Chamber of Commerce is a Republican partisan pollster, and it has him winning by 15. So you can kind of see where the slant is. But according to non-biased sources, as good as he can really get it, he's still winning by 8, which is massive, considering that he's known for winning by about 1% each time he runs for office. So that's truly remarkable there. Looking into the state of Texas, the results are basically a mirrored opposite of the 2018 race against Beto O'Rourke, where we actually saw a pretty thin race given the state of Texas being normally known as like this huge home of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a huge red state, hillbillies galore. But you can see that Cruz only won by about 3%, whereas in 2024, he's leading in the most recent polling as of 2 months ago, or less than, by about 13 points, which is really, really huge. It shores up a lot of Republican money, which low-key was diverted in 2020 to the state, and so that's a big thing for Republicans. Now, moving on. Moving on to the state of New York, you can see that it's polling about 20 points pro Schumer, which is not surprising, but this is news to me because a lot of people have been really manic and really excited, frankly, and maybe a little bit too much, and truly bullish on the prospects of Republicans in New York going forward. We saw that in 2022, the midterms were really good. When you had Lee Zeldin going against Kathy Hochul, it was a great result at down ballot for House representatives and whatever have you. That being said, of course, folks, at the state level, I don't really see this changing anything. And so when you look at it, a 20-point victory for Schumer runs in line with the reality. Now, so we have a blue New York like usual, nothing crazy there. Now we are going to move towards the next state, which is Minnesota, which we don't have to really cover. In fact, Minnesota is so blue, despite it being somewhat close to a purple state. It's actually surprising. We have seen in the last videos, the last one I made in this topic about 10 days ago shows that no surprise. Look, Klobuchar is winning by 14 as of last month, and it's really bad because clearly that state ought to be closer given how bad it's been run, and yet still very solid blue, and so I was not corrected there. So there we go. Moving on. New Mexico's a state that went only 5 points blue when Ronchetti ran last time, and so the polling has been kind of really absent considering the fact that, again, it was somewhat competitive in the last election, at least for governor, I think. And so for this to be the case where there is no polling for 2024 is a little bit astounding, but we do know that it's historically have been a blue state. No matter how good the Republican is, it seems like they cannot get over the finish line there. And so that's really too bad for them. But I think I'll take a little bit of an educated guess and say New Mexico stays blue. But to elaborate further, we can see that Virginia is also not being blessed with any money, much like the federal government treats it in real life. When it comes to the political, they're not really indulged in any sort of spending. And, in fact, when you look at the sort of crumbs they do get when it comes to the national media, they're getting attention as of a month ago, basically, for their primary. That's what they care about, who wins the Republican primary. So much like the opposite of California, they only care about one partisan side because they're so guaranteed to win. The math was totally different if you guys followed this from the beginning, where obviously Manchin could have made it close, but in fact, it's basically a lock. And so now you have a 51 majority for the Republicans. Maine is all too similar, and it's all the same, really, when you think about it. You see that there's no polling as of the last 4 years for Maine when it comes to the Senate, which is unfortunate, which leads me to think that it's going blue easily, as that's the nomenclature going on here. Now, keep in mind, Susan Collins did beat Sarah Gideon despite all the polls looking really bad for her. And so that might be a little bit of a silver lining for Republicans. But truth is that I don't see that happening. So 42-51. Let's see if the Democrats can really kind of close the lead here. Virginia seems to be a little more competitive, as you can see that there has been some spending as of recently. Now, we do know that Fabrizio is a Republican partisan group. Not necessarily, but it just generally is. And the sponsors Virginians Against Neighborhood Slot Machines. So a pretty narrow minded issue voter base there. But when you look at it, Kaine is still beating Hung Kao, who is Asian, by 12, which is not a good sign, but also not surprising given the fact that Tim Kaine is a typecasted, like 60-year-old neoliberal Clintonian Democrat. In fact, was the vice presidential candidate under Hillary in that ticket in 2016. And so this is of no surprise to anybody. So we can see a blue Virginia in the Senate. It should be closer at the presidential level, I would assume. We'll wait until November for that. But moving on. When we look at Ohio, you'll notice right off the bat that the polling has been, I think, still lacking in respect to sample sizes. 405 likely voters is still probably not cutting it to get a good sample. That being said, they have Brown up by 8, which I think is redonkulous. But I mean, that's depressing because, again, this is the only poll we can work off of ever since the primary in March. And so it's a very complicated process to follow. But as of right now, it's a Brown victory, which, again, doesn't make sense. But now, Pennsylvania is an interesting one because this is probably the one swing state where I could see it going blue, and relevantly so. If you guys pay attention to Bob Casey, the Democratic incumbent, he's more popular than the general Democrat has been at the federal election level. And so he should outperform Joe Biden. And so while Biden could lose by 3, I could see Casey winning by 1 in real life. Now, according to polls as of last week, which are decently sized ones, you'll see that McCormick, who is a pretty bad candidate, is known as like a carpetbagger business type, doesn't relate to people, kind of like less charismatic Mitt Romney, if that's possible. But anyway, McCormick is losing by about 7 percentage points in the most recent polling, or by 8, depending on what you pick. Either way, that's a solid W for the Dems. And so you can see them closing the lead here, according to the latest polling. Moving on. Now, Michigan's also an underfunded venture. If you guys notice, the polling has not really matched up the importance of the race. Of course, this is an open seat in a swing state to end all swing states, Michigan. And so for this to not receive the funding necessary is appalling. But if you look at outside the primaries, you see that the most recent poll doesn't even have a likely voter threshold. It doesn't even have a list of amount of people they asked who they were going to vote for. But according to this, Slotkin is winning by 3, which is appalling because, again, this is only adding up to less than 80% of the total vote. So there's a metric crud ton of undecideds here. But even moving a little bit before that to last week, you'll notice that Slotkin was up by 1 over Rogers, the presumptive nominee, Mike Rogers, for the Republican Party. And it's tied as of this also the same poll, basically, with a bigger sample size. So I think it's dead in the middle, but I'll lean Democrat for now, given the lack of funding. I think that maybe the Democrats who have had control of that seat for decades will keep it. I don't think that'll happen, but you can just nerd that out in the comments if you disagree. Now, Wisconsin's now. Again, a serious underinvestment problem, okay? You see that the polling is recent as of a week ago, but there's only 300 people in this thing. Only 300 people polled. You ought to be getting about 1,000 or more, ideally. In my last video, if you guys remember, that morning consult poll had over 10,000 people surveyed, and yet these can't even manage 500. It's actually appalling. But anyway, you look at this poll as of last week, and Baldwin's up by 8 or 5. That's an enormous margin of error, given the fact, of course, that it doesn't really line up with each other, despite these polls being conducted at the same time. And, the bigger poll, by the way, this poll has 290. This one has 340. The one with 340, as in the bigger one, has Hovde, the Republican, doing 3 points better than the smaller sample size. So again, what that probably means, if you were to put that in a trend graph, is that if you were to reach, let's say, 1,200 respondents, perhaps Hovde would tie. And so that leads me to think that the undersampling of people is really a killer to the election prospects of Hovde when it comes to polling right now. But according to the gimmick of the video, I will tell you now that according to the latest polls, however, bad they are, I will say inadequate to say the least, do have Tammy Baldwin winning re-election. Nevada, as you all know, is a state that is going to be really close at the Senate level, in my opinion. And I think you agree. Now, when you look at this, folks, The most recent polling is all over the place. In fact, they're still polling the primary, despite Brown, the guy who's disfigured, probably being strong in this case. But anyway, when you look at the actual 1v1, you see that Brown is losing to Rosen by 14%, which is insane. Insane. Okay. Granted, Tyson Group is not a huge pollster, as well as obviously this is only 600 people being polled and not the ideal 1,000. Like, I think it should be the benchmark for everybody. That being said, of course, you look at a couple of weeks before that and Rosen's still up by 11 or 13. And it's not so much that Rosen is super popular, as in like she's over 50% majority support, but more so that Brown's in the 30s. And so that seems like it'll close in as he starts matching the coattails of Donald Trump's presidential prospects in Nevada, which he seems to be leading. But for now, we're going to leave that blue. Again, subject to change as we get closer to the election. More funding equals more accurate polls anyway. And so moving on to the final state of Arizona. Arizona is also looking pretty dire. Again, no polling in the last, I would say, 15 days. That being said, we do have some smaller pollsters by the Florida Atlantic brand. And you see that Gallego is beating Lake by 7 or 8 percentage points. Now, again, another trend line. 500 people sampled in this vote. Gallego wins by 8. When you sample 600, Gallego's winning by 7. So again, if you were to trend that out, that means if you were to sample, let's say, 3,000 people, all of a sudden Lake is tied or has the lead. And so it seems interesting to me that this race is kind of open, low-key, though a lot of people are saying that the nails are already in the coffin for Kari Lake. But I will say that this should narrow. And again, these polls are probably inadequate. That being said, again, the bigger polls have the Republicans doing better in a few of these races, and I hope you guys notice that. But anyway, the final result, according to the latest polls, is 52 Republican Senate seats in November of 2024 as compared to the Democrats' 48. That being said, I hope you did like the video, and I mean literally do press the like button. It helps out a lot. Comment down below any suggestions, disagreements. Again, this is just ripping the polls straight as they are. I believe that half of these results are not going to be what they will be in November in reality. For example, I disagree with Nevada. I disagree with Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, but you get the gist. So I'll see y'all on the next one. Adios.